Ready? Testing, testing. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. Testing. Testing for the court reporter.
our photographers here than ready.
Committee will come to order. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. Our committee is honored to welcome Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin to testify on President Trump's fiscal year 2018 budget proposals for the Treasury Department. Secretary Mnuchin, we're grateful for your time and thank you for your testimony. As members of this committee know, our annual hearing with the Treasury Secretary on the President's budget plays an incredibly important role in our work. Today's conversation will help set the stage for collaboration between Congress, the White House, and the Treasury Department. Today's conversation will help us identify in advance efforts to grow our economy, create jobs, and increase Americans' paychecks. Today's conversation will help encourage a constructive, open dialogue focused on addressing the challenges facing our businesses and workers, our communities, and our country as a whole. Reading through President Trump's fiscal year 2018 budget proposal, it's a welcome change to see that this budget, unlike the Obama budgets of the past 8 years, balances in the next decade. The President's proposals take much-needed action to grow our economy, create jobs, and help more Americans move from welfare to work. We're also pleased to have President Trump's leadership on tax reform. Secretary Mnuchin, as you're aware, pro-growth tax reform is a top priority for our committee. In the past 6 days, we've held 2 full committee hearings on tax reform, where we've heard from American businesses, large and small. They are eager for a simpler, fair, and more competitive tax code. They want to hire more workers. They want to increase paychecks. They want to invest in the future of this great country. Today, we're eager to hear more about the President's proposals to create jobs, grow paychecks, and strengthen our economy for the long term. America faces a number of significant policy challenges with a broken tax code, an unsustainable national debt, an economy that's performing well below its potential. These challenges do not impact only red states or blue states. They impact American workers and families in all areas. And they impact the constituents of every member of this committee, no matter if you're a Republican or Democrat. We're committed to working with President Trump and with you, Secretary Mnuchin, to solve them. Again, we're grateful for your time today. We look forward to hearing your testimony. And I yield to the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Neal, for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I might begin with a parliamentary inquiry.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, how will members be recognized for the purposes of asking questions to the witness? How does the chairman intend to implement what we know as the Gibbons Rule?
Yes, so Committee Rule 14, which is often referred to as the Gibbons Rule, states that members who are present at the beginning of a hearing will be recognized in order of their seniority, that other members arriving after the gavel will be recognized in order of their appearance. The rule goes on to provide the chairman discretion to adjust the order of recognition based on the ratio and the number of members from each side of the aisle so as not to disadvantage members of the majority. This is why we often go to a 2-to-1 ratio at some point during a hearing. However, Mr. Neal, I am sensitive to the concerns that you raise about not disadvantaging members who were present at the start of the hearing, and will endeavor to use my discretion to adjust the timing of when we go to a 2-to-1 ratio in a way that doesn't disadvantage the members who are on time. This may look slightly different at each hearing depending on the circumstances, but I and my staff will work with you and yours to achieve a fair outcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There were some of us on the committee who were actually here when Mr. Gibbons was the acting chairman of the committee, and that rule has worked very well to prompt members to be here on time.
I agree.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Neal, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, it's a pleasure to see you again, and thank you for joining us today. A budget is a reflection of one's values, and President Trump's budget is no exception. The President's budget cuts program after program that middle-class families rely upon every day. You name it. The Community Development Block Grant Program, Stafford loans for college students, all drastically cut or zeroed out. The budget also breaks the President's repeated promise not to cut Social Security and Medicare, cutting Social Security benefits by up to $64 billion. The budget also cuts Medicaid by more than $600 billion on top of more than $800 billion in cuts in the Republican health care bill. And it would also restrict health care coverage for children under the CHIP program significantly. For Democrats, our values today reflect a strong commitment to the middle class. For every issue we consider here in Congress, the first question we will ask ourselves and the majority is the following: Will it help working families? And if the answer is no, we won't support it. Let's face it, for many American families, this has not been an easy time to make ends meet. You work hard every day, sometimes in multiple jobs, but it's still tough to earn enough money to make sure there's adequate food on the table and a roof over your head. It's in particular a struggle for many young Americans today. The front page of the Boston Globe this week included a story about how the loss of blue-collar jobs is forcing young men to fall down the income ladder. This is a reason why working families sent a strong signal to Congress last November. Many Americans were convinced that President Trump understood the importance of the middle class and that he would be a different kind of Republican who would work finally to make sure that they would have an edge and an opportunity. Unfortunately, the budget that we have witnessed in the last 48 hours is one that has let those people down in dramatic fashion. We were elected to help America's working families, and that's why our priority must always be the middle class. So what are some Democratic priorities? A key priority is to provide affordable, quality health care for all Americans through programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP. More and more middle-class families rely on Medicaid for long-term care. It pays for 60% of all nursing home residents nationwide. As the baby boomers age into Medicare, it would be irresponsible to cut funds in this critical program. The reason mom and dad aren't living in your attic is because of Medicare and Medicaid. And 95% of the American children have insurance coverage thanks to Medicaid, CHIP, and previously bipartisanship. It provides health coverage for working families struggling to make ends meet. We know the tax code is broken, in desperate need of repair, and that is why we must continue to pursue reform. But we must reject ideology and move forward in a bipartisan manner to create a tax code that is fair for middle-class Americans. Middle-class families are frustrated by stagnant wages, a tax code that favors those at the top, and an uncertain financial future. Any tax reform plan must be about moving the dial to help middle-class families grow and prosper. Another priority for this side is very simple, ensuring that working families are financially secure in retirement. We're about to experience a retirement savings crisis in this country. According to Boston College's National Retirement Risk Index, about half of today's households are at risk of not being able to maintain their pre-retirement lifestyles once they stop working. Far too many Americans are not able to save enough for retirement. We also will continue to support initiatives to help America save, like the Auto IRA, making the Savers credit refundable, and as you know, I'm a big supporter of tax incentives for retirement savings. We should be helping to rebuild and reinforce Social Security along the lines proposed by our colleague, John Larson. This would allow Social Security to continue to be the foundation of middle-class economic security for 171 million workers who contribute with every paycheck, knowing that Social Security will be there for them when they retire, and if they become too sick to work and to protect their families in the event of their death. Let me close by saying that we will continue our focus on this side to make sure the middle class is first. It's going to be true on every issue that comes before us, from health care to taxes to retirement, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Without objection, other members' opening statements will be made a part of the record. Today's sole witness is U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. The committee has received your written statement, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. You have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. Secretary Mnuchin, welcome, and you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Chairman Brady, Ranking Member Neal, and members of the committee, it is an honor to be here today, my first time appearing before the House of Representatives. I am looking forward to working with members of Congress in this committee on passing important legislation for the American people. My number one priority as Treasury Secretary is creating sustainable economic growth for all Americans. The best way to achieve this is through a combination of tax reform, regulatory relief, and protecting taxpayers. This also includes making some difficult decisions with respect to our budget. We are currently bearing the cost of excessive government commitments of previous years, and this has forced us into hard choices. But the remarkable thing about economic growth is that it builds upon itself. If we develop the right policies today, our children and grandchildren will reap the benefits of an ever-growing economy. Indeed, in the next 10 years, if we return to the modern historic average of above 3% annual GDP growth, our economy will grow by trillions of dollars. This will be meaningful to every man, woman, and child in this country and future generations. Tax reform will play a major role in our campaign for growth. It has been more than 30 years since we have had comprehensive tax reform in this country. The administration is committed to working with you to change that. We have about 100 people working at Treasury on this issue now. We are working diligently to bring tax relief to lower and middle-income Americans, as well as make American business competitive again. All of this comes as we simplify the tax code and make it easier for hardworking Americans to file their taxes. Finally, I would like to speak about the importance of free and fair international trade. Few doubt that free trade is a crucial component of economic growth, but trade deals that disadvantage American workers and business can hardly be considered either free or fair. In meetings with my international counterparts, I have stressed this dual importance. Just 2 weeks ago, I had productive meetings with the finance ministers of the G7, and earlier I met with the members of IMF and World Bank. They understand our concerns, and we have approached our international dialogue with a renewed spirit of mutual understanding. In the President's joint session to Congress, he spoke about the marvels that this country is capable of when its citizens are set free to pursue their visions. Fundamental to that freedom is removing imprudent regulation and uncompetitive taxes from blocking their way. There has been a significant few months at Treasury. We have been studying, developing, and implementing policies that will put this country on the path towards sustained economic growth. In coming months, we will work with this committee and Congress, and we will look back on an important time for this nation's economy and our history. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions today.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. First, thank you for your laser focus on jobs, especially those for the middle class, and certainly the recipe for moving this country forward are lower taxes and a tax code built for growth, balancing red tape so our local businesses can thrive, and expanding our economic freedom to trade, because as we know, it's not simply enough to buy American. We have to sell American all throughout the world. You play a key role there. Mr. Secretary, currently we have nearly $20 trillion in debt, and you are using extraordinary measures until Congress addresses the debt limit later this year. To its credit, the Trump budget cuts deficits by $5 trillion, but that still leaves increased and growing national debt of $4 trillion more. Absent in your testimony today is any reference to the debt limit, though I know that you continue to make the case for action by Congress. As Treasury Secretary, you also serve an important role as managing trustee of the Social Security and the Medicare trust funds. Together, these two programs are the largest drivers of our debt. More than that, they are under financial duress for the long term, and I worry about them. Also absent from your testimony today is any mention of ways or even the need to improve the solvency of these critical programs, which I know we share. As managing trustee, shouldn't we be working to make sure that our children and grandchildren can count on these important programs, just like seniors and individuals with disabilities do today? Mr. Secretary?
Chairman Brady, thank you very much for your comments, and I appreciate your focus on both the national debt as well as Social Security and Medicare. So first, let me just comment on the debt. We are very concerned that the debt has gone from $10 trillion to $20 trillion over the last 8 years. And we believe that the most important issue is economic growth. As I said in my opening remarks, the difference between 2% and 3% sustained GDP is trillions of dollars over the next 10 years. So that is our absolute focus. I would also just comment in regards to the debt limit. As you've outlined, I've used my extraordinary powers, but I would also like to emphasize for this committee and for the rest of Congress, I urge you to raise the debt limit before you leave for the summer. We can all discuss how we cut spending in the future and how we deal with the budgets going forward, but it is absolutely critical that where we've spent money, that we keep the credit of the United States as the most critical issue. It is the reserve currency of the world, and we need to make sure that we can raise our debt ceiling to pay our debts.
As part of the upcoming dialogue on increasing the debt limit, do you intend, or the agency intend to present solutions to preserving Social Security Medicare for the long term as we go forward?
As you've mentioned, I take my role as managing trustee very seriously. I've begun to look at and review with my staff the draft reports that we will be reporting on the trust funds, and I look forward to working with Congress as we work through that and look at it. Thank you.
Thank you. Is your final point, to that end, so is your preference for Congress to pass a clean debt ceiling?
That is my preference.
Thank you. Mr. Neal, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for the assertive manner in which you addressed that issue of raising the debt ceiling. And I was very happy that the chairman raised that question immediately. The debt ceiling used to be an issue that we used to address here in Congress in a bipartisan manner. So your emphatic support of raising that debt ceiling is much appreciated by all of us today. Just a couple of points, if I could, again, based on long service with the committee. In 2001 and in 2003, there were tax cuts that totaled $2.3 trillion. They were advertised at the time as the basis for promoting strong economic growth. And in fact, that economic growth not only did not occur, but it was the slowest growth since Herbert Hoover had been president. And yet, the debt that we talk about today is conveniently suggested that somehow it happened during the last 8 years. So not only was there subpar growth in those years, but the deficits began to mount. There was a war in Iraq and a war in Afghanistan with 1 million new veterans who we are obligated to care for. And then there was the recession, in which we were losing up to 800,000 jobs in some months. So when you consider that social spending is formulaic, and at the end of the Clinton years, there were 23 million new jobs and an unemployment rate of 3.8%, the Clinton economic plan appeared to work. And not only did federal revenue go through the ceiling, and Secretary Greenspan warned us that we were paying down the debt too quickly, but we had balanced the budget for 4 successive years. The unemployment rate at 3.8% meant that social spending, much of which is formulaic at the federal level, also was reduced significantly. And I'm concerned that the model that is being offered and discussed, and I hope there'll be a chance for us as we go forward, but I would urge you, based on long experience here for many of us on this committee, that ideology, as it relates to revenue, frequently doesn't square with revenue forecasts. And trying to project what the future might look like, suggesting that, for example, that automatically we're going to 3% growth, or in the Clinton years, which averaged 4.2%, in the Reagan years, I believe, 4.1%, that most economists think that is unlikely. I think we would be supportive of what you would like to do, but getting there is very different than what we would all like to do. So mindful of the fact that even as you've proposed 3% growth, I think we need to argue and acknowledge that that will not be an easy task in modeling a tax cut for people at the top based upon 3% growth that might not happen seems to me to be a bit of a risk. And you might want to respond to that.
Well, I first just comment, I know we all share a common view of trying to create economic growth in this country, and I hope we will all work together to do whatever we can on those shared goals. So that is our #1 objective. We've been working very closely with Chairman Brady and others at the Senate on comprehensive tax reform. We think this is a critical component of economic growth. We fundamentally believe in dynamic scoring, which implies that when you change tax policies, you do impact behavior. There are many, many economists who believe this. Like anything else, there will be different models that come out. And when we present a combined tax plan, different people will have their views. But I can assure you we are very focused on being able to pay for tax reform, and we are looking at policies that we're going to do everything we can to get to 3% growth.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be real quick. Mr. Secretary, it's great to have you last week meeting with us, and I hope that that continues. We want to work with the administration to come up with a pro-growth tax plan. As you probably know, this committee's been working for a decade at reforming the tax code, and so the amount of work and work product that we have here and scoring, working with joint tax is quite considerable, and I hope that you will continue to work with us as we move forward so that we can deliver the type of growth that you want to achieve.
Thank you. We look forward to that and look forward to building on all the work and expertise as you've been focused on this.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate you being here. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. You're recognized.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. I think it's important to look where there's common ground, also to acknowledge where there are some deep differences. That may be the only way we find common ground. In February, you said there would be no absolute tax cut for the upper class. Are you willing to sit here today and say, under the tax plan, there will be absolutely no tax cut for the upper class?
Yes, I did say that, and I think I was actually honored by some people at the Senate who nicknamed that the Mnuchin rule. So I feel like I'm now in good company with the Volcker rule and the Buffett rule.
I'm not sure it's the same company.
Well, I'll take it that way. In any event, the President's objective on the personal side of tax reform is to simplify the tax code. I think we would all agree the tax code is way too complicated. The IRS is too big on reviewing personal taxes.
Mr. Secretary, I agree with that, but if you would you answer the question?
I am. I was going to get there. So I wanted to start with the President's objective is to have a middle income tax cut, and that's consistent with what I've said earlier. Right now, what we're looking at is cutting the taxes on the high end and eliminating all deductions other than mortgage interest and charitable donations. Let me just say that this was a short form for the administration's proposal. We are working very closely, as I said earlier, with Chairman Brady and others on trying to reach a consensus for tax, but the President's objective is to create a middle-income tax cut.
Okay, but that really doesn't answer the question. In the one-pager that came out, it cuts the top rate, it eliminates the estate tax, it repeals the AMT, and repeals the ACA investment tax for those earnings over $200,000. So are you willing to sit here and say there will be no absolute tax cut for the upper class?
Again, let me just say, this is going to be a collaborative process for tax reform to pass. Obviously, it's going to be something that's got to be a collaboration between the House, the Senate, and the administration.
Okay, so...
And when we come out with the tax plan, we will show the distribution, as you would expect, and you will see it. As I would just comment, again, our objective is to cut the high-end tax and get rid of lots of deductions that will offset that.
Thank you. All time has expired. Mr. Tiberi, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary, for being here today. Really appreciate your time. I was pleased to see in your budget request to fund the CDFI in order to maintain existing programs like the New Markets Tax Credit Program. I hope that's an indication that the administration is supportive of the program, which has been effectively targeting investments in low-income communities, both urban and rural, across the country. I've been a big supporter of it, and it's bipartisan. I was unable to attend the hearing yesterday on international competitiveness that the chairman held, but I just want to associate myself with my colleagues who've expressed a concern with the current border adjustability tax proposal and its impact on consumers and workers. However, I've been one of the strongest proponents of reform, comprehensive reform. I know you are as well, and I look forward to working with you and the rest of the administration of implementing actual tax reform this Congress. Making our tax code more competitive, I think, is really important to economic growth. And we're going to hear, and we already have heard a little bit about economic growth and data regarding economic growth, maybe being a little bit too optimistic, but I want to put in perspective a similar conversation we had 8 years ago, Mr. Neal, and I'd like to compare just for a moment the President's budget with President Obama's first budget. So in its first 4 years, the Obama budget projected average economic growth of 4%. The Trump budget less than 2.8%. The Obama budget projected average growth of almost 3.2% over the first decade. The Trump budget, 2.9%. Obama's projections the first year of his presidency seemed pretty reasonable around here at the time, given historical economic growth levels following a recession. But it's not surprising in my mind that President Obama's projections never materialized because he pursued an anti-growth, increasing taxes, more regulation policy that left us $20 trillion in debt. This president, the Republican Congress, on the other hand, have already gone on record to not only try to reduce regulations and the regulatory burden, the president signed now a dozen-plus bills, as well as pursuing tax reform, lowering rates, and ultimately balancing a budget. Mr. Secretary, just a quick thought on the border adjustability tax and on Mr. Nunes's point about economic growth.
I've had the opportunity, Chairman Brady and I have been meeting almost every week since I've been in office. I think we're working very closely together. I've discussed that there's some concerns we have on the border adjustment tax, but we're looking forward to potential changes that Chairman Brady may look at that, but we're working very collaboratively, and our objective is to get comprehensive tax reform done.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. Mr. Secretary, I've often said that a budget proposal is a statement of values and priorities. This administration proposal makes it crystal clear that the hungry, the middle class, the elderly, and the struggling will be left out and left behind. This budget says more money for war, for guns, for weapons. This budget breaks promise after promise to the American people. It raised Medicaid and Social Security. It cut funding for food assistance and support for those who have been left out and left behind, as I stated. I've said over and over again, and I believe it today, that we have a right to know what is in the food we eat, what is in the water we drink, and what is in the air we breathe. This budget cut EPA. This is not right. This is not fair, and it's not just. I have a strange feeling that this budget is not respecting the American people. It's not, the people are not top priority for this administration. I think we can do much better. I've served for a long time as the ranking member on the Oversight Subcommittee, and we've been very, very concerned about how the IRS has been squeezed. We don't provide enough funding for the Internal Revenue Service to collect the dollars. I'd like for you to respond. Why are we squeezing the IRS? Why do we continue to cut and cut?
Well, first let me just comment that the budget does reflect the priorities of the President around the military. And you are correct, there's been some very difficult decisions made to fund increases to the military. The President thinks that the national security is of the utmost importance to the country and that we've underinvested in the military, and that there are other areas where we needed to make difficult decisions. I would also just say that I do agree with you, and I know the President believes in clean air and clean water. Matter of fact, I had the opportunity to visit Flint, Michigan with him during the campaign, and that was quite concerning. Particularly as it relates to the Internal Revenue Service, I am comfortable that we have preserved within the budget very significant commitments to increasing our technology.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize. The time has expired in this questioning. Perhaps we can pick it up later in the hearing. Mr. Reichert, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. In hearings over the past several years, we've heard testimony about how permanent tax policy drives investment, growth, business decision-making far more than temporary tax policy does. In fact, in our hearings just last week, a witness shared with us that permanent, comprehensive tax reform is absolutely critical for him to make business decisions, and certainty in the tax code helps American workers. Can you share the administration's views on temporary tax reform versus permanent comprehensive tax reform and tax policy?
Sure. I think our preference is to permanent over temporary, but I would just say permanent is better than temporary, and temporary is better than nothing.
Well, if we were going to go, we want to go permanent, we want to go comprehensive, how does that help? I'm especially interested in small business, so how does that help small businesses? Can you describe what a permanent tax code might do to help businesses, help workers, create jobs, increase the GDP, whatever?
Sure. I mean, I think, first of all, we have a very complicated business tax system that's one of the most uncompetitive in the world. We have a very high corporate tax rate. We tax on worldwide income. We have a concept of deferral. It's not a surprise that our companies have left trillions of dollars offshore. And as part of this, we want to make sure that money comes back onshore, is invested to create jobs. And I think a big part of the engine of growth in this country is small businesses. We want to make sure that the business tax, not just the corporate tax, is something that benefits small and medium-sized businesses as well. That's a big priority of ours.
And at the end of your testimony, you briefly mentioned trade, and I happen to be the trade subcommittee chairman, so I look forward to working with you and your team at the White House on upcoming trade issues. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Doggett, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Do I understand correctly that you do not believe we should finance tax reform by borrowing from abroad to pay for it? You think that this tax reform should be fully paid for with economic growth, changes in spending, and other tax policy?
I do believe it should be fully paid for with changes in economic growth and with other ways of broadening the tax base.
Great. And do you believe that in its current form, the border adjustment tax poses a significant risk to the American economy?
Again, we've had conversations on the border adjusted tax.
Sure, and I understand you're trying to be collaborative, but as it's proposed, you have stated that it poses a significant risk to the American economy.
I have expressed in its current form I have concerns with it.
And isn't it in such bad shape on the border adjustment tax that the administration does not plan to propose a way to fix it because it doesn't know of a way to fix it?
Well, I don't think it's our job to fix it.
But you don't propose to.
Again, we are working very closely with Chairman Brady. Okay,
but you'll count on him to come up with the idea. The administration will not be bringing a border adjustment tax proposal here.
I think the intent is Chairman Brady is going to look at changes.
Now, as you know, the Republican colleagues here, like you, are very over-optimistic, in my opinion, but optimistic about the benefits that this tax reform will bring to economic growth. and they have included within their projections significant benefits from economic growth, dynamic scoring, to which you referred, to pay for it. But they concluded that that was not enough, and $1.1 trillion of their paying for it comes from the border adjustment tax. What specific changes in tax policy do you advocate? Can you identify any specifics, as distinguished from just generalized comment, to make up for that $1.1 trillion gap if the border adjustment tax goes?
Well, let me just comment on, we have a terrific career staff at Treasury. We have a lot of resources. We have over 100 people working on this. I have some senior advisors who are full-time focused, and there's lots of different scenarios we're running.
Okay, as they look at that, will you also have them look at the $2 trillion hole in your budget that comes from double counting? Because you've counted the benefits of your budget of economic growth to both pay for the tax cut and to pay for other provisions in the budget. So I think we're really looking at over $3 trillion and have yet to hear a specific change in tax policy you advocate. Further, can you tell us whether the Mnuchin rule that Mr. Levin asked you about, is it your policy now or not your policy? Just yes or no. Is it in effect? I know you want to collaborate, but is it yes or no, the Mnuchin rule is what you advocate?
All time has expired.
Can you just answer yes or no?
We will have to give the Secretary time to answer within your moments.
Mr.
Mr. Roscom, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, 2 points. One's kind of a touch and go, and one's a little more substantive. So touch and go, as it relates to border adjustment in particular, our committee has really struggled over the past several years dealing with anti-base erosion rules. I mean, really, really struggled in a very unsatisfying way. The Obama administration really struggled. Section 385, which you're very familiar with, redefining debt and equity, doctrines that had been well placed for 40 years. None of them work. The attractive thing about border adjustment is that it works. So if all we're doing is lowering the corporate rate and flipping to a territorial system, it creates a huge incentive to put IP out of the country, and therein lies the rub. I know you're on top of it, we're on top of it, but that's one of the things that we need to get to. So that's the touch and go. Here's my real point. We've got to sort out, and you and I had a discussion last week, just to continue to highlight this, the capacity at Treasury and the U.S. Office of Foreign Asset Control as it relates to Iranian terror. Iran, as we know, is the world's largest state sponsor of terror. They don't repudiate it. They don't walk away from it. We could reconcile the relationship if they came clean and stopped it, but they're continuing to do that. As you know, there's large commercial aircraft companies, Boeing and others, that are determined to sell to the Iranians, notwithstanding the bad activities of the Iranians. Can you speak to that, to your current review, your current understanding? And from my point of view, and I think most on the committee and most in the House, you've got the authority, you individually, as the Secretary, have an incredible amount of authority to fix this and keep us safe and to make sure that the world's largest state sponsor of terror does not get access to commercial aircraft which are fungible and can be used for military purposes.
Well, let me just comment that one of the most important parts of my job is on anti-terrorist financing. And I'm probably spending 50% of my time on what we call TFI at the Treasury, Terrorist Financing and Intelligence. These tools are absolutely critical. They really work. In the case of Iran, there's no question the sanctions are what brought them to the table. I believe we could have gotten a better deal with them at the table. We will use everything within our power to put additional sanctions on Iran, Syria, and North Korea to protect American lives. And I can assure you that's a big focus of mine, and I discuss it with the President. As it relates to the licenses that you're referring to, yes, it is correct that both in the case of Boeing and Airbus, there are licenses that will be required, and they are under review.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I was heartened to hear the Secretary say that the debt ceiling issue was important. And I'd suggest that we as a committee, in a good show of bipartisanship, send a letter signed by the chairman and the ranking member and all of the committee members to Speaker Ryan and Leader Pelosi, stating that we believe it's important to raise the debt ceiling and prevent the type of catastrophe that the Secretary stated. And I could do that as a motion or whatever you think is appropriate. Would you be willing to do that?
Please present any draft letters to us, and we'll certainly consider it.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for being here today. It's good to see you again. I continue to be concerned about going down this road of we're all going to come together and do great tax reform, and I want to be there, and I want to be part of that. But there's a distinct difference between tax reform and just tax cuts. And I continue to worry that as time slips by, we may get into the mode where folks are just looking for a quote-unquote win, and we revert to just the tax cut. And if that happens, as you've explained, it's not tax reform, and it's highly likely that it won't be paid for. It's just going to add to the national debt. So I want to make sure that I understand you are committed to a revenue-neutral bill. You don't want to borrow to do this. You want to do tax reform, not just tax cuts. Is that correct?
It is correct that I want to do tax reform, and I want them to be paid for through broad-based changes to the tax code and economic growth, and that is what's critical.
Thank you. On May 21st, 2015, the President, then candidate, stated that I'm going to save Social Security without any cuts. I know where to get the money from. Nobody else does. And then we see a budget with tens of billions of dollars of cuts in regard to Social Security disability insurance, despite the fact that the President stated that he wasn't going to cut Social Security. The President does understand that the disability portion is Social Security. These are people who have paid into the system and have become disabled and can't work. And they rely on, thousands of people throughout our districts rely on the fact that they have this disability insurance program to provide for them while they're disabled and out of work. These cuts are going to hurt those folks, they're going to hurt those families and those communities. Is it the President's intention to make these cuts in Social Security and deliver this devastation?
Thank you. All time has expired. Mr. Buchanan, you're recognized.
Mr. Secretary, thanks for being here. 3 quick points. You mentioned that we've been running trillion-dollar deficits for the last, okay. Let me go back. In terms of deficit spending, I've been here 10 years. We've run a $10 trillion deficit. There's plenty of blame to go around. But I want to make sure the administration is committed to moving towards a balanced budget at some point in the future. A lot of tough decisions got to be made on a bipartisan basis. But when I look around this room, a lot of young people, and we're going to bury them in debt if we don't change it quickly. You're a business person. At some point, this ends badly.
I can assure you the President's very focused on the long-term impact of the debt.
The second point is just on pass-through entities. I know you refer to business, but 93% of the businesses formatted in Florida are pass-through entities. Last time we did tax reform, they were looking to lower corporate rate. I want to make sure you guys are committed to also get parity with pass-through entities, small businesses. In some states, it's as high as 50% when you add state and federal together. I want to make sure you're committed to not just corporate reduction, but pass-through reduction as well.
We are absolutely committed to what I would call the business tax pass-throughs, but I also want to just say we will want to make sure that rich people can't use pass-throughs to evade the personal tax system. But yes, we are committed that small and medium-sized businesses have the benefit of this.
And the other point is on the IRS reform. I chair the Oversight Committee, and we want to make sure something gets done in this space. It's been 20 years. We've talked about it briefly. But as we do tax reform, it makes a lot of sense to do IRS reform. And I just want to also get your commitment that you guys are thinking about that, because it's a real opportunity in terms of business disputes, in terms of being more customer friendly. What's your thoughts on IRS reform?
We're very supportive of that, and as I mentioned earlier, we need to invest a lot of money in technology at the IRS, and we have preserved those investments as part of the budget.
I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Larson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Mnuchin. Let me start by applauding you and your staff. I really appreciate the conversations you've had with Mr. Neal, Mr. Courtney, and myself, and letters from the Taxpayers Associations about a god-awful situation for people in the state of Connecticut facing crumbling foundations. And we sincerely appreciate your efforts to further look into this and help them. Let me also add with my colleagues, I think you're absolutely right about the debt ceiling, and we should have resolution before we leave here this summer. We cannot leave here in August and have the uncertainty that will result from this and the gaming and the politics that will take place. It could be a calamity for the country. We stand solidly behind you in this effort. Now, if Mr. Doggett asked you a question, yes or no on the Mnuchin rule?
Again, what I've said is the President's objective is not to cut taxes on the high end. His objective is to cut middle-income tax cuts. But this is a process that will be both the House, the Senate, and the administration, and we're working together.
All right. That's not the answer. But let me also ask you what Mr. Thompson asked you, and that's whether or not you intend to follow through on these $64 billion cut out of Social Security.
So let me just say, the President is absolutely committed that people who should be paid disability will be paid disability. That's what the trust fund is for, and we'll honor those commitments. So the assumption for changes in disability, and again, I would just say these are assumptions that perhaps there are some places where people should be going back to work, but that for people who long-term cannot go back to work, they will not see a cut in their disability.
Well, listen, I hope that this committee will go to regular order. We need a discussion on Social Security. Social Security is insurance. It's not an entitlement. People have paid for this. They understand it. We're going to debunk this myth once and for all. I appreciate what Sam Johnson has said, that he's going to have an open hearing on this, and the vitality of ideas and what we plan to do with Social Security ought to be out in the open. I appreciate your invitation also to come down to the Treasury and talk about ideas that we have on both sides of the aisle to make sure that we strengthen this. But this hasn't been touched since 1983. Has anyone in this audience insurance premiums gone up since 1983? Of course they have. And so we turn around and trick the elderly all the time and tell them they're greedy geezers. These people are depending upon this. They've contributed throughout their lifetime into a fund that is insurance, the most successful governmental program that has a 99% loss ratio. That's pretty good in the private sector, isn't it, Mr. Mnuchin?
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Mr. Smith, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for taking the time to be here and share your insight. I think that a lot of work is being done, both here in Congress, in the House, and also at the White House, and I appreciate the fact that I think there is a lot more similarity between the details of perhaps what the White House would choose to do on tax reform, as well as what we are with the blueprint, and a lot of thoughtful minds are working, and I would certainly invite even more folks to join the process as we do move through regular order, and how important it is to bring people together so that we can work together to solve the challenges that we are facing. We know there are trade-offs that need to be evaluated as we sort through the details. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process of deciding on how to move forward with various trade-offs, and perhaps looking at finding the right base broadeners as we help achieve permanent tax reform. I certainly associate myself with the comments of Mr. Reichert and how important permanence is for tax reform and how much more economically productive that would be as well. Can you speak to perhaps the trade-offs?
Well, again, I would just comment on the process. We've started conducting listening sessions. We've had the opportunity to be both here and at the Senate and meet with both Republicans and Democrats to get ideas. We've also had the opportunity to meet with many outside groups and many industry groups comprising of business CEOs. And we're looking forward to, I'm sure, as the committee is getting feedback on different ideas, doing that as well.
Okay, I thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kind, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you I give you great credit for being here today. The President, in his first formal budget submitted to the American people, conveniently released it during a week when he's out of the country. So in my mind, he either owes you a great apology or combat pay for coming up here and defending that proposal today. And there are problems with it. Not only was it dead on arrival by the time in here, it was dead before arrival. And that's why so many members on both sides of the aisle are running from it. And I represent a large rural district in Wisconsin. There's not much to like in the President's budget proposal for rural Wisconsin. It guts funding for the Rural Economic Development Grant Program, guts funding for the Farm Service Administration offices and technical assistance they provide family farmers. It guts the funding for USDA broadband extension programs in rural America. The $900 billion that the administration is adopting in Medicaid cuts will put our rural hospitals in great jeopardy, our Badger Care and senior care programs in Wisconsin. Other than that, what's not to like for rural America? It just seems like a missed opportunity with the type of economic growth and the partnership that rural America is looking for the federal government today. But I also appreciate that you and many of us are interested in taking a run at the code for the first time in 30 years. And yet one of the linchpins of what's being discussed around here, the border adjustment tax, you've had some concerns about. In fact, you were recently quoted the other day, and I quote you, one of the problems with the border adjustment tax is that it doesn't create a level playing field. It has very different impacts on different companies. It has the potential to pass on significant costs to the consumer. It has the potential of moving the currencies, end quote. Would you care to amplify or express any of the concerns and whether there's things that can be addressed as we're working on tax reform?
I think there's things that can be addressed to lighten those changes, and those are the types of things Chairman Brady is working on. And again, I think the most important issue is that we share common goals of making the business tax system competitive, middle-income tax cut, and simplifying personal taxes, and doing all these in a way that will create economic growth.
Yeah. And finally, as Treasury Secretary, you're going to play an instrumental role in getting the President's trade agenda back on track. Don't give up on it, and don't give up on walking away from multilateral agreements as well. I don't know if you caught the New York Times article about Harley, one of our iconic companies in Wisconsin, setting up a factory in Thailand now. And the main reason they're doing it is because of the failure of TPP from moving forward and the 60% tariff that our bikes are facing as we're trying to export it into the Asian market, forcing them then to move a factory into Thailand to take advantage of the ASEAN markets and the lower tariffs that they're going to be able to gain market access. This is one of the consequences of walking away from a robust trade agreement where we need to be at the table, establishing the rules and trying to level the playing field for our workers, our farmers, and our businesses back home. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kine. Ms. Jenkins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. I represent a district in Kansas where we have a great deal of common sense, and I can't find many, if any, Kansans that support our current tax code. I think they're eager for lower rates for individuals and corporations, international reforms that will bring jobs home, simplification, and job growth and economic benefits. But I remember 30 years ago, the last time we did this, as a CPA, I was on the tax floor, and I watched the headlines, and it seemed like every day tax reform died a certain death. But it was able to be accomplished because we had a president at the time, President Reagan, who, along with his administration, breathed new life into this thing every stinking day that it died. My frustration since my time on the committee has been that we've not had a president or an administration that was committed to rewriting the tax code. And now we have a president that ran on this. And so I'm just curious, will this president be willing to get out in front and lead on this issue? Will he visit with the American people about the issues that are important to them, engage the stakeholders, work with Congress on this effort?
Yes, I can assure you that once we have further details and we're a little bit further along, this is one of the president's highest items. I had the opportunity to work with him on the campaign over the last year on his economic plans, and the president has very absolute intention to be part of selling this to the American public.
Will we see any additional details to the plan that you're working on in the near future, or are you going to rely on leaders on Capitol Hill to promote those ideas and work alongside you?
I can assure you, Chairman Brady, Chairman Hatch, myself, Gary Cohn at the White House, we are all working as fast as we can possibly be. This is our highest priority.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Pascrell?
Mr. Chairman, I've been advocating this committee request President Trump's tax returns using Section 6103 to code the authority, so forth. I think my efforts have been no secret, so I'll get right into the questions. Section 6103 specifically states that the Treasury Secretary shall furnish copies of the President's tax returns for internal review by this committee upon request from the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. Mr. Secretary, we know how much time, so a yes or no answer would suffice. If and when this committee uses Section 6103 authority to request Mr. Trump's returns, will you comply with the directive in the law?
I'm not familiar with that section, so I'll have to review it with my internal legal department, but I'd get back to you.
We need fundamental tax reform, but the Congress and the public have no way of knowing how this president stands to personally benefit. It's one of the problems we had back in 1924. And no way of knowing if he is getting special treatment from the IRS. Secretary, if for no other reason than to eliminate a distraction from your agenda, will you encourage the president to release his tax returns?
I'm not having any discussions with the president. That's his decision what he does.
Secretary Spicer said on April 17th that the president will not release his 2016 tax returns because they are under audit. We know that tax returns can be released while under audit, and that every president's tax returns automatically are audited. Nevertheless, can you confirm that the president has indeed filed his 2016 tax return yet, or has he filed for an extension?
I'm not aware of it. I don't have access to that information.
As the head of the Treasury Department, can you confirm to this committee that his returns from each of the past 10 years remain under audit?
Again, I don't have access to that. That's within the IRS. I don't have access to specific taxpayer-level information.
We know that in the tax plan that's before us, we see a $200 tax break on. The other side isn't going to cut it for the many folks in the middle class. If you do away with doing away with the deduction for state and local taxes, that's about, on the average filer, $3,500 compared to the $200 that you're talking about in this particular, let me be charitable, budget that you presented. Our state faces the highest property taxes in the country. Like many other states, we have a high cost of living. How do you justify this revenue grab from middle-class homeowners from high-cost states like New Jersey?
Again, I think fundamentally we think that the federal government should get out of the business of subsidizing the states, but we are sensitive to the transition and want to make sure that the middle income does have a tax cut.
Thank you. Time has expired. Mr. Paulson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, thanks for being here. As you know, startups are young firms with little to no revenues as they work to build a concept into successful companies. In fact, a medical device company and startup can go a decade without even taking in a dime of revenue while they invest millions of dollars trying to build a successful product and then get FDA approval. So tax policy tends to impact their business model in a different way than most industries that we speak about in tax reform conversations. But these entrepreneurs are clearly driving the future of the American economy, and their success has a huge impact on our economic competitiveness. And that's why I've made modernizing the tax code to encourage entrepreneurship a priority. For example, I'm working hard to rationalize the tax treatment of stock options for startup employees, legislation that we actually got passed and through the House last year in Congress. I'm also working to find a way to protect startups from being unfairly penalized by the Byzantine loss limitations and tax regulations, which can then depress investment in capital-intensive companies. And discrete policy initiatives and issues like this will absolutely make a difference for the entrepreneurs out there that are seeking to build the next Apple or the next Amgen. So I'm hoping that you will work with those of us on this committee. Mr. Crowley's another advocate for some of these concepts. Hoping you'll work with us in some of these concepts in tax reform that encourages that new company formation. And can you share a few thoughts on that? Is that something you think there's an opportunity for forging ahead for the entrepreneurship component within the tax reform model?
Yes, and we look forward to working with you on your ideas on that. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thanks for being here. I noticed that part of your plans as we go forward are whether it's public-private partnerships or private activity bonds when it comes to addressing infrastructure and then government-owned properties. Mr. Blumenauer and myself are engaged in a piece of legislation that would actually do that, and along with Senator Heller in the Senate. So I think we have both bipartisan and bicameral agreement on this. If you can just for a little bit try to address some of the large problems we have, and we can use private and public bonds. We can do the activity bond. We can do so many things that bring the public into this, and they see their investment taking place the right way. And just, if you can, and I know you're on a tight schedule, the administration's views going forward of how we're going to finance infrastructure and government-owned buildings that need repair.
We are very supportive of public-private partnerships and look forward to working with you and your ideas on that. I think, as the President has said, that infrastructure investment is critical importance to him and this country. And we're looking how we can fund $1 trillion of infrastructure without just increasing the national debt. So we are looking for all different types of partnerships and incentive mechanisms.
Well, we're really looking forward to working with you. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Crowley, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Great to have you here before us. Mr. Secretary, I believe that a budget reflects a statement of the values that our country has for the aspirations, the hopes of the people. And I'm frightened, quite frankly, of the values reflected by this budget presented by the President and by the Republican Party in this specific budget. Mr. Secretary, don't you agree that protecting the homeland is the number one and ought to be the number one job of our federal government?
I think that protecting the homeland is the number one job, and that's a combination of military, intelligence, and protection here.
And reflected, that would be the Department of Homeland Security, correct?
That is part of it, yes.
Then why does this current budget cut funding for the Homeland Security programs for people living in areas at the greatest risk of terror after, for instance, places like the city of New York?
I'm not familiar with the specifics of their portion of the budget, but I know that General Kelly is very focused on Homeland Security. I have enormous confidence in what he's done, although I'm not familiar with the specifics of that part of the budget.
Well, Mr. Secretary, I hope that you do familiarize yourself with it, because I know you're a New Yorker at heart as well, and wouldn't want to see New York.
I am a New Yorker at heart.
Wouldn't want to see New York disadvantaged in any way, especially because we know that New York was a target, is a target, and will always be a target. I'm also concerned about what I see happening to our nation's vets, our veterans, by slashing $1.4 trillion in Medicaid funding that will leave at least 2 million vets without access to care. I'm pleased that my friend and colleague from Nevada, Ms. Rosen, Jackie Rosen, is taking this issue of cuts to veterans' care head on. We ought to be encouraging taking care of our vets when they come home, not using the VA as a piggy bank for a budget or for this Congress's budget. Finally, this budget cuts $64 billion from Social Security. Social Security is an earned benefit that workers pay. their own money into, and is not a pool of cash for Congress and the President to use for their own spending needs. So I don't delineate between Social Security and Social Security disability. Individuals, workers pay into Social Security. The average Social Security recipient with a disability worked and paid into Social Security for 22 years before becoming disabled on the job. So, Mr. Secretary, you can spin it any way you like, and the administration can as well. A cut to Social Security disability is a cut to Social Security, especially those people who are disabled and can no longer work. Cutting them or making it more difficult for them to receive that benefit is cutting Social Security. And with that, I know my time is up, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Meehan. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us. I was very grateful to hear your discussion in relation to the questions that Mr. Roscom asked about the time you're spending looking at terrorist financing around the world. One legacy issue that we're still unclear on relates to the Iran nuclear deal that was struck by the previous administration. You're now in a powerful position to understand more about details that were not so clear previously. One ambiguous question relates not to the small sum or the significant sum that was turned over to Iran, the $1.7 billion that they've been able to utilize by virtue of the release of the 4 hostages. But there have been great difficulty in actually calculating what other kinds of Iranian assets had been subjected to sanctions that were subsequently lifted according to the agreement. It's been estimated in the New York Times, U.S. News and World Report, and other places that it's anywhere between $100 and $150 billion, dollars that could be released back into Iran to be utilized for numbers of purposes, but including the potential that it would be funneled back into the sponsorship of terrorism. Is there any ability for the Treasury Department to identify what actually is out there in the form of assets which had been previously frozen, which may still be in some status of being frozen still? Can we calculate if, in fact, $100 or $150 billion was returned to Iran? Because part of the agreement certainly reflects the idea that there are supposed to be snapback provisions associated with that, as well as complete compliance by Iran. Some would question whether they have been. I think you understand the tenor of my question, but the focus is, can the Treasury Department calculate what there is with respect to Iranian assets? It seems like they're mostly oil proceeds and other kinds of things that have been suspended in Asian banks and otherwise. But where it is, what it is, and whether it still may be subjected to sanctions. I close my comments by saying, in addition, there's about a $45 billion credit, to families of terrorism, which has been won in American banks, which I believe should be used against any assets before any dollars are turned over to Iran. But I'm wondering if you could have Treasury calculate what is actually still potentially subjected to, being held away from Iran.
Yes, we have very good data and very good access to information, obviously on a classified basis. But we're, as I mentioned earlier, the sanctions are very effective. We continue to put sanctions on Iran, on their ballistic missiles, and on terrorism.
Thank you. Time has expired. Mr. Renacci, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you, Secretary Mnuchin, for being here. I'm very excited to have someone leading Treasury who's committed to getting our economy moving again. You cite 3 areas that can help our economy grow: tax reform, regulatory reform, and protecting taxpayers. I'm a strong supporter of getting tax reform done as soon as possible. I spent 30 years in the business world before coming here, so I understand we have to be able to compete. The U.S. likewise has to set its corporate rate to compete. I'm pleased that your tax reform outline included a 15% corporate income tax rate because, to borrow President Clinton's political strategist James Carville's line, it's the rate, stupid. It's hard for U.S. companies to compete against Canada, where the federal corporate income tax is 15%, or Ireland is 12.5%, or even the UK, which will be at 17% by 2020. So thank you for what you're attempting to do. As history reminds us, 99% of temporary tax cuts in 2011 were eventually made permanent. Would you support a temporary corporate tax cut?
Again, as I said earlier, permanent is better than temporary, and temporary is better than nothing. So these are trade-offs we'll have to make as we go through and score the various different alternatives.
I understand, and I heard you say that earlier, and I agree. Do you support eliminating the deduction for interest as part of the tax plan?
Well, first of all, on the individual side, I support maintaining the mortgage interest deduction, and on the business side, my preference is to maintain interest deductibility, which is important for small and medium-sized businesses, but we're looking at that like everything else that's on the table.
Do you support extending the 10-year budget period to a longer period so that we can take a look at tax reform and maybe get some tax reform done that fits within the reconciliation window?
I've heard people suggest that, and I think that's a very good idea to consider strongly.
Regarding 385 regulations, which went far beyond discouraging legitimate cross-border mergers. Instead, they cast a wide net that disrupt ordinary business transactions. You know, this is, of course, an issue. I want to thank you and the President for reviewing these regulations. Do you have a sense on when the review will be complete?
I don't. It's under review. It'll be preliminary for me to give timing on that.
Right. Again, I currently work on legislation to combat the problem that we have on fraud, waste, and abuse, but also tax reform issue regarding improper payments. The legislation I'm working on requires taxpayers to maintain books and records to support amounts reported as earned income. This is the earned income tax credit. Clarifies taxpayers who self-report must calculate EIC based on all allowable deductions related to self-employment income, and permits the IRS to disallow EITC and improper education credit payments without a formal audit. Will you commit to work with me on that legislation?
All time has expired. Mr. Higgins, you're recognized. Ms. Sewell, would you like to be recognized?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mnuchin, I really think all of us in this room know that we need to do something to make our corporate tax rates more competitive for our industries. I think that the concern, though, is how do we make sure that it's revenue neutral, that it's deficit neutral, that we also make it distributional, neutral as well. And so my concern is how are we going to pay for it? What are your views about, I mean, I know that the President issued his one-pager, and on that one page, it didn't say how he was going to pay for it. So can you speak to how he's going to pay for it and what your views are about the blueprint that's been ushered out by the Republicans that say the border adjustment tax is the way to go?
Well, let me just comment that many economic surveys show that over 70% of the cost on corporations are passed on to the workers. So
is that trickle-down economics? Because I can tell you that
it's
the
not
folks I recommend
economics. This is real. This is absolutely. There are multiple reports on who bears the economics of the tax. But in any event, as we progress on the details, we'll come out with more details on the plan and show.
So what is your view on the BAT, the border adjustment tax?
Again, I think I've been explicit in saying that I think there's certain concerns with it in its current form, but we continue to work with Chairman Brady and others at looking at it.
Well, I have to tell you that I found it quite offensive to hear that the OMB Director Mulvaney, in his rollout of the budget yesterday, redefined compassion to be a calculation of how many Americans you can kick off of social safety net programs. And I think that what I'd like to hear from you is what programs, what line items in the budget that was rolled out yesterday actually reflects this administration's commitment to working families and to those that are most vulnerable in our society.
I think there's lots of programs, and again, I think the biggest focus is economic growth and putting American workers back to work.
Well, I think it's a misnomer to assume that people who are on SNAP are not trying to work. Most states have work requirements, and in fact, 50% of the people who receive SNAP only have it for 10 months or less. So I just think that in taking $190 million out of SNAP, for example, nutrition assistance, that is not showing compassion. And I just submit to you that a rising tide lifts all boats, that people who live in vulnerable communities are just as American as you and I, and they're looking for a hand up and not a handout. And we all could benefit as Americans if we make sure that as we rise, they rise too.
Well, time has expired. Ms. Noem, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for coming today. Appreciate you being here to answer some questions. I represent the entire state of South Dakota, which our #1 industry is agriculture. So I have some questions that would relate to that topic today. You know, and I understand my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have been criticizing the president's budget, but we fought funding issues in President Obama's budget every single year. He cut agriculture dramatically. So this is something that Congress has the opportunity to provide funding for and put our budget together. And I'm always hopeful that rural America will do well and continue to feed the world. I wanted to talk to you a little bit because you mentioned in your opening statement about trade and what a critical component that is of the plan to get the economy growing again. And I appreciate that. NAFTA has been good for agriculture. We do have some fixes that need to be done, and I know the administration is renegotiating that agreement. I would just encourage that as we go through that process that we don't damage the market we've already created there. We have some issues with dairy and other commodities that need to be looked at, and so I'm glad that we've identified that and that the administration is going after it. The other concern with agriculture, though, is that while we renegotiate trade agreements, that we miss out on market opportunities. Other countries are looking to negotiate with these countries, and we need to be aggressive going after them currently so that we don't lose that market access in the future. So I would just encourage speed as we negotiate free and fair trade with other countries so that we lock up those markets for the United States. And then also I wanted to touch on agriculture programs just and how it is impacted by tax reform. Thank you. Thank the administration for looking at repealing the death tax. That hit my family personally. It's a double taxation, it's an unfair tax, and it should be repealed. So I want to thank the administration for identifying that in tax reform. But also, interest deductibility, like-kind exchanges, expensing are all important to the agriculture industry. And I just wanted to ask you your thoughts on those issues and how we go forward.
Well, again, let me just assure you that agriculture is one of our most important exports, and this administration is doing everything it can to make sure that more markets are open for our farmers to export things. In our recent negotiations with China, we're pleased that we've opened the market to beef. It's been over 9 years since our farmers have been able to sell beef, and that's something that was very important to the president.
Thank you. And again, we do have other countries that are trying to access other markets that we're still in negotiations with. So speed is very helpful so we don't lose that potential in the future.
Good. We understand that. Thank you.
And on tax reform, those are critical components that we're hoping if we get rates low enough that those small farmers that do feed the world and feed this country. I always talk about agriculture as a national security issue. We need to grow our own food so other countries don't control us. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hogan, you're recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. I want to compliment the professionalism of your staff. I've had an opportunity to meet with a number of them to talk about some discrete issues. I look forward to working with you and them as we go forward. I agree with you about growth. It's the key to solving our debt problem. It's the key to prosperity for future generations. I'm not so sure I agree with you about temporary tax cuts being better than no tax cuts. Because if we have temporary tax cuts, you know, they rarely incent the growth that you want. It doesn't incent the behavior you want. And if we have temporary tax cuts that contribute to our debt problem, I'm afraid this is not going to be good as no tax cuts. But we'll work through that. I think we agree that permanence is the best, and I believe we can get there. We all agree that moving to a territorial system is key. The base erosion is a problem, and a territorial system for business tax is a solution. I'd also like to point out that we are only one of 2 countries, Eritrea being the other one, that tax our citizens regardless of where they live, have worldwide taxation rather than residency-based taxation. And last week we were hearing from executives, and I've heard from a number of people, that this makes our U.S. citizens extremely unattractive to hire abroad because it costs up to 40% more to hire a U.S. citizen for a position in another country. So if we're going to make our companies more competitive worldwide, I hope we look at making our citizens more competitive worldwide by looking at a residency-based taxation for earned income. I think that would be an added benefit to tackle while we're tackling comprehensive tax reform. We talk about companies leaving the country. We had over 5,000 citizens expatriate last year. That was a huge increase. It's over a 500% increase from what the expatriation rates were from over 10 years ago, 26% increase from just last year. So that's another area I hope we can work on. And then lastly, I want to pick up from something that Ms. Noem brought up. We appreciate the President including in his budget the elimination of the inheritance tax. Hope that we will also look at the elimination of the gift tax as well as the inheritance tax. The two go, in my mind, go very hand in hand. And to any extent that a gift tax elimination might cause some problems, we can find rules to rein in any abuses of gift tax elimination. So look forward to working with you on that. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Higgins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary, for being here. You're the principal economic advisor to the President. The tax policy that's been advanced to this House would provide 3 million wealthy Americans with about a $200,000 tax cut and about 250 million not-so-wealthy Americans with a $200 tax cut. The White House says that the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget says that the White House budget will increase the national debt by $5.5 trillion. Economists in the right, left, and center say the tax cuts don't pay for themselves, they never will, and they never have. You want 3% growth. I want 3% growth as well. All of us do. I just want to urge the President to do a robust investment in America infrastructure. It won't pay for itself, but most economic studies indicate that you could reclaim about half of the money that you lay out for infrastructure, given the jobs that would be created and the resources in the private sector that would unleash. It's very important, I think, to the growth of the economy because that's the way that you reduce debt and deficit. China is making a major move to displace America as the global economic leader. China just announced a $1 trillion infrastructure bill to open up China to 47 other Asian countries so that they can sell their stuff to 47 new markets more efficiently. We have a budget that wants to spend $1.5 billion to build a $40 billion wall that we were told we would never pay for. Your budget wants to spend $3 billion a month to continue a 16-year war in Afghanistan. In response to a $2 trillion need for American roads and bridges with a pathetically weak $200 billion investment in infrastructure, maybe. I just think that, the focus on tax cuts here should not be discussed in and of themselves. It's got to be something increasingly more. And that infrastructure investment is so critically important to the competitiveness of America. And I would urge you to please urge the President, on behalf of the American people, to advance a real infrastructure bill that will create real growth and unleash the resources of the private sector. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Rice, you're recognized. Oh, excuse me, Mr. Smith? Mr. Rice.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, since 1986 was the last time we did tax reform. And at that time, our code was pretty competitive. But in those last 30 years, the world has left us by in terms of the philosophy of their tax system. Every industrialized country, all of our trading partners have border adjustment in some form. Now, since 1990, our manufacturing base has declined precipitously. In 1990, 50% of the Americans were in the middle class. Today, 43%. In 1990, the median household income in 2013 dollars was $52,000. Today, it's $52,000. So the middle class has shrunk, and they haven't had a raise in 27 years. And I believe that's a direct and foreseeable result of our antiquated tax system. Now, last week, Ambassador Lighthizer was here talking about renegotiating NAFTA. And I asked him, how are you going to get around the advantage that Mexico has with their 16% value-added tax, their border adjustment? He said, you know, that creates a real problem. Yesterday, we had a hearing on the border adjustment, and the CEO of Archer Daniels Midland here talking about agricultural exports, corn, wheat, soybeans. We've lost 50% of our market share in the last 30 years. And our primary competitors are Russia and Brazil, both with 15% plus border adjustment. So when China, which has 6% of the world's land and 20% of the world's population needs to buy grain, are they going to pay 15% more for American grain because of our antiquated tax system? Now, I hear you say, and you know, I read about it in the periodicals, that you got problems with border adjustment. But as a tax lawyer, I had doubts when I got into it too, but the more I've learned, the more I recognize this is a necessary component if we want to rebuild our middle class. So what I want to know is, where are you on border adjustment? How can we solve your problems? And if you don't like it, what else can we do to rebuild our manufacturing base, rebuild our middle class, and give them a way overdue 27-year raise?
Well, I can assure you our priority is the middle class and is making sure that our businesses are competitive. And we absolutely share common goals on what we're trying to do to make American business competitive.
How can we do revenue neutral tax reform? How can we make our tax system competitive if we don't do border adjustment, which every other industrialized country has?
Well, as you've commented on other countries, do I have time to continue?
So perhaps Mr. Schweiker could yield a moment for the answer because time has expired and we're really staying tight on that. Mr. Schweiker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Moment.
So I was just commenting on the border adjusted. Many other countries do have a VAT tax system and a corporate tax system and use them in conjunction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Treasury Secretary. Can I run through just a handful of things because we're supposed to be actually discussing the 2018 presidential budget. And I will tell you, one of the things I did appreciate is someone that actually believes compassion is actually also thinking about my 19-month-old little girl and the ocean of debt she will exist and live in and spend the rest of her life paying back for what we have spent today. So I hope there is some compassion for the young and what we're doing to their futures. Could you actually walk me through, as I'm looking at the budget line items right now, what you believe actually the 2018 borrowing is going to be?
I don't have the 2018 borrowings in front of me.
If I look at some of the numbers right now, at least it looks like in the 2017, we have actually used an additional raise in the statutory debt limit of $816 billion. That's obviously debt sold to the public and borrowing from internal accounts. Looks like we're still going to actually need $740 billion of new borrowing capacity, both from internal accounts and outside borrowing in the 2018 year. So, and I beg of our brothers and sisters here in the committee, you know, I've heard so much talk, but the GDP numbers actually look reasonable. I mean, for next year, you actually are saying for 2018, I think, what, 2.4?
That sounds about right, yes.
2.4 and then 2.7 in 19 and 2.9. You don't actually start saying we're at 3% GDP until the 21?
No, I think they look quite reasonable. We scale up to 3%. That's correct.
So I've heard this dance here in some of the publications saying, oh, it's crazy, we're going to, it doesn't have, you know, compared to some of the Obama budgets we look at where sometimes there was 4+ GDP built into them instantly, the numbers here look actually fairly reasonable. My great interest with here is, as we actually get up against the debt ceiling, how do we work with you to also do a series of things that revolve around debt management? You know, look, we're going to continue to bathe in debt because of our demographics. How do we encourage you to actually do the full-throated look at the long-term bonds, the trills, other things of sweeping idle cash in accounts to do what's necessary for the debt management?
Yeah, I can assure you we are carefully studying all these issues. We're looking at ultra-long bonds right now, both 50 and 100-year bonds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and thank you for allowing the Secretary to finish that answer. Ms. Delbene, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us today. Prior to Congress, my work was as a businesswoman and entrepreneur, and I know how important it is that we have a responsible budget, but also responsible fiscal policies. You brought up the debt ceiling, and earlier today, Director Mulvaney was speaking with the House Budget Committee and talked about the need for perhaps approving a debt ceiling, addressing the debt ceiling earlier as revenues were coming in slower, and so this might be a more urgent issue. Do you believe that this is a more urgent issue and that we need to make sure that we pass this by June so we aren't waiting till the last minute in the need to provide certainty and stability, as folks talked about going forward, that we need to do this right away?
I think it is absolutely important that this is passed before the August recess, and as far as I'm concerned, sooner the better.
So you would support doing it right when we get back from Memorial Day, and that this needs to be a clean bill addressing raising the debt ceiling?
I'm supporting that this is done as quickly as possible, yes.
And that it's clean? I worry that people have played politics with this in the past, so are you on record as saying this needs to be a clean bill focused just on raising the debt ceiling?
I mean, my preference is that it gets passed as quickly as it can. However, the House and the Senate want to pass it. My objective is to get this done quickly.
And that would mean a clean bill, I would assume.
That would be my preference.
Thank you. Also, when we talk about making sure we have a responsible budget, there are a lot of assumptions that have gone into this budget, many concerns that I have with the concept that tax cuts will automatically pay for themselves. But when we look at assumptions too, we really need to be assuming a future economy. And you've said publicly that job loss due to artificial intelligence and automation is not even on your radar and won't be real issues for another 50 to 100 years. But many technologists and industry experts estimate that, for example, by 2032, half the trucks on the road would not have human drivers, or that the trucking industry's current size could transition to automation. That means that 1.75 million lost driver jobs over the next 15 years. So if we look at these issues that are upcoming, shouldn't we be making assumptions and realizing the need for job training and making sure people have skills in a new economy, things that right now are not addressed in this current budget and would impact people's ability to have the jobs of the future?
Yeah, let me just comment. When I made the comment on artificial intelligence, and there's different views about artificial intelligence, I was referring to kind of like R2-D2 in Star Wars. Robotics are here. Self-driving cars are something that are going to be here soon. So I am fully aware of and agree that technology is changing and our workers do need to be prepared.
Thank you. Ms. Walorski, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thanks so much for being here and for taking the time. You know, an issue that is resonating in my district, and I know, you know, as we talk about these big items, I look at this issue with the IRS, as somebody mentioned earlier, as like a logistics thing. The IRS is the face that most Americans are dealing with as we look at individuals and even corporations. And so this was part of the blueprint. And you know, I spent a lot of time going around my district. I get a lot of feedback from folks who really want a fair, simpler tax form, and they want us to assure them, and I guess I'm interested in your position here, on this issue of a service-first IRS. Because the American people deserve, and one of the reasons that we've gotten so much feedback on this is because our blueprint says that the American people have a right to quality service, privacy, confidentiality, and a fair and just tax system. And I know you kind of alluded to this earlier, but I'm just interested, I guess, to hear from you that this might be a little box that we're talking about logistically in here, but how important this is to the American people who don't trust the IRS. So where is this on your priority list? Are we working together toward the same goal here?
Absolutely. I can't read that box from this far away. But,
I just read it to you.
Based upon what you said to me.
I didn't skip a word.
You know, as I've said, technology is very important to keeping taxpayers' information safe and secure in the world of cyber issues is of enormous importance to me. We support the idea of 95% of the American public should be able to fill out their tax form on a large postcard. We want to simplify this, and the American taxpayers deserve that they're treated fairly with the IRS and have appropriate service.
And I appreciate that. And I guess the other reason I'm asking this, Mr. Secretary, we had a subcommittee meeting with one of the IRS advocates who do an incredible job. They've done a great job for my constituents in Indiana. But there's been such a hesitation on the side of the IRS to invest in commercially available technology that's being used around the world, but millions, multiple millions keeps getting shoved into the IRS with no new technology to show for it, some kind of a problem with commercially adaptive kind of things that are already working. Do you see that commercially competitive window opening finally with be able to modernize this technology?
I can assure you I have a technology background, and I will be spending a lot of time with the IRS and other areas of the Treasury on upgrading our technology.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here with us today. I, a couple months ago, had several tax policy roundtables throughout the 5 major cities of our congressional district, which is Southeast Missouri. And at all 5 of those roundtables, I had people that showed up from all different backgrounds, farmers, small business owners, families, big businesses, taxpayers, and some individuals that don't pay taxes. My question, the issues that came up at every one of those roundtables were two that was consistent in all 5. One is to simplify the code, which you were just referring to. And very grateful to hear that. And I look forward to hearing more policies in the future of what the administration, how they would like to simplify a 70,000-page tax code. The second one kind of follows on what Mr. Rice said. And everyone in our district said, we want the tax code to put a level playing field for the farmers and small businesses in Southeast Missouri. Right now, we're not at a level playing field, and President Trump has said that numerous times, is that we need to make sure that we have a tax code that puts us on a level playing field. What is that approach?
Well, again, I think that's an absolute priority, and whether it's through trade deals or whether through the tax code, the President has said, and I agree with, we need to have reciprocal trade, that free trade is reciprocal.
I've read your statement of a reciprocal tax. Could you explain what that is?
Well, again, I think the concept is, and how we get there, but the concept is that if we're charging somebody 0 and they're charging us 25%, that's not free and fair trade.
So would you be able to implement a tax just on individual basis, or how would you do that overall? It wouldn't be would it be in the tax code?
We're happy to follow up with you on it. I mean, there are obviously technical issues in how we do this and whether we do it in our trade agreements or what we do. But the idea is reciprocal, free and fair trade.
I totally agree with you. I just would be happy to get the details to try to help push those policies.
Thank you.
So I appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Chu, you're recognized.
Secretary Mnuchin, there are many questions I could ask, but I am compelled to comment on your administration's budget, which leaves all but the wealthiest few with horrific cuts. Remember when this president said he would save Social Security without cuts? He loudly proclaimed, "Believe me," and many did. Well, it turned out not to be true. In fact, when asked if individuals receiving Social Security disability insurance would receive less from this budget, OMB Director Mulvaney said, "I hope so." Now, you yourself, Secretary Mnuchin, said that this budget wouldn't touch entitlements. How does that square with the proposed $600 billion cut to Medicaid included in the president's budget released yesterday? This is not the time to mince words. This budget's assault on the 99% of average Americans will cost lives. And what's worse, the bare-bones Trump tax plan that slashes taxes for the wealthy and exacerbates inequality is used to justify the financing of this horrendous budget. Essentially, the Trump tax plan combined with the Trump budget guarantees that many people will suffer so that those on the top can get richer. I'm thinking of my people like my constituent Caitlin. Caitlin became disabled when she was 29, and despite what people like OMB Director Mulvaney will tell you, she did work. She worked for years until she couldn't anymore. But when her health meant she could no longer continue, she signed up for SSDI. This was not because she was lazy or because she wanted to live off the government. It was a tragic necessity that came at great cost to her. In fact, she now lives below the poverty line and makes so little that she didn't even meet the minimum income requirements for affordable housing projects in the area. When Caitlin heard about the budget, she wrote to me on behalf of the 1 in 5 Americans who have a disability and who know they still have much to contribute to our country. What Caitlin needs is help. Help to get out of poverty, manage her health problems, and know what it feels like to contribute again. She wants this, but it's being taken away from her thanks to the cuts in the budget needed to pay for Trump's tax cuts. And that's the rule of the Trump budget, which is that if you're doing well, you get more money through a tax cut. If you're struggling to work because of a disability, you get less. If you run a family business like, say, the Trump Organization, you get a pass-through business tax break. If you have a family and lost your job, then too bad for you. Well, people like Caitlin and the millions of Americans who work 1, 2, 3, or 4 jobs deserve better than what this budget has to offer them. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Cabello, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your presence here today. I'd briefly like to associate myself with the Chairman's comments at the beginning of this hearing, where he discussed the importance of reforming and strengthening programs like Social Security and Medicare. I think it's critical that the administration work with this committee on not just making sure we keep our promises to today's seniors, but also tomorrow's seniors, people in my generation, people younger than me who would like to see these programs around for us when we get a little older. Mr. Secretary, the budget provides continued support for the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program, as well as tax counseling for the elderly and low-income taxpayer clinics, or VITA, which provides assistance for low-income and residents in underserved communities in filing their tax returns. We are dedicated to creating a service-first IRS. Can you talk about the importance of these programs for the IRS and how they fit into that service-first mentality that we'd like to see the agency adopt?
Well, we're going to review all the different service areas at the IRS. And I think we're going to make sure that we bring a mentality of customer service, particularly there's a lot of things we can do online, and make sure that we're responsive.
But specifically with regards to these programs that serve the least fortunate, people who really struggle to file their tax returns and to comply with the law, can you make a commitment that the administration is going to make sure that as we look at reforming the IRS, making it more customer-focused, that we will pay special attention to these services that help the least fortunate in our country?
We absolutely want to make sure that we have the proper services for the least fortunate. We want to make sure that these are the right programs and they're working, but yes.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Another issue, the budget proposes reducing improper payments by increasing the data sharing capabilities between agencies and support for business systems modernization. Can you discuss the importance of business systems modernization and data sharing to the IRS, again, in the context of this service-first approach?
Well, again, I think it's just critical that we invest in the infrastructure at the IRS and make sure that we have the technology and that we look across agencies. And I'd also just comment that our fiscal services area within Treasury touches almost every single receipt and payment, and that's something we'll also continue to work on.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And I'll just say, speaking for myself, that as we reform the IRS and as it becomes that agency that is really on the side of American taxpayers, I truly believe that we should allocate more resources to the agency so that it can help us effectively administer the tax code in our country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here.
Thank you. Ms. Sanchez, you're recognized.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for taking the time to appear before the committee today to discuss the administration's fiscal year 2018 budget. I hope that we can find ways to work together over the coming years. But I have to begin by saying that I'm profoundly disappointed and almost offended that you have been sent here today to sell us on the president's budget proposal. In your testimony, you said, if we develop the right policies today, our children and grandchildren will reap the benefits of an ever-growing economy. I couldn't agree with you more on that sentiment, but where you lose me is on almost every single line item in this budget. I continue to believe that budgets are a clear reflection of our priorities, and if these are the president's priorities, then I'm pretty appalled. Our priorities should be pretty clear: creating an environment for good-paying jobs that allow workers to support themselves and their families, offering our children a chance to achieve their dreams through higher education, and fostering an innovative business environment that allows domestic businesses to thrive. To me, the president's budget would be laughable on these points if it wasn't so sad. He guts student loan security, the social safety net, and retirement savings for hardworking Americans. And with the few minutes that I have, I'd like to dig in on a couple of specific items that are mentioned in the president's budget. I want to start with the paltry parental leave proposal. While the president's paid parental leave proposal may help spur a long overdue discussion on the issue, that is about all that I can see that it achieves. The president has said over and over again that we'd be tired of winning under his presidency. Well, if a proposal that keeps us dead last in parental leave policies among developed countries is winning, then I'm afraid to see what losing really looks like. The budget proposal also lists important items for tax relief for American families, citing an expanded standard deduction and helping families struggling with child and dependent care expenses as one of the priorities. Family care expenses are serious issues and present my constituents with some of the most difficult economic decisions they face. But in this budget, these issues seem to be reduced to little more than a soundbite. Child care costs in this country are staggering. In many states, families are spending more to send an infant to daycare than they are spending to send a child to college. My constituents deserve a serious proposal that addresses this issue, and I stand ready to work with anyone across the aisle on serious proposals that try to address those issues. But I remain profoundly disappointed by the dismal budget that we are discussing today. And with that, I thank the chairman and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Dr. Davis, you're recognized for the final question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. Both conservative and progressive policy experts agree that the refundable earned income tax credit is an amazing pro-work success story with strong evidence of encouraging work and alleviating poverty. Indeed, the major expansion of the EITC was led by conservative Republicans. The Earned Income Tax Credit helps Chicagoans Illinoisans, and Americans. Almost 14% of my constituents and 8% of Illinoisans benefit from the EITC. In my congressional district alone, just under 100,000 workers with children earning less than $50,000 receive the EITC. Moreover, 5% of my constituents benefit from the refundable child tax credit. Given the high number of working poor in my district, it is alarming that only 15,000 of my constituents benefit from the child care and dependent tax credit, showing that this tax credit fails to help the lowest income workers. That is why I am introducing a bill today with Representative DeBonnet that makes the child care and dependent tax credit refundable and increases the maximum credit per child to help middle-class and low-income families. I'm deeply concerned about the Republican tax plan that appears to cut or, at best, restrict these critical support for middle-class families. When 1/5 of children in the U.S. live in poverty, and in a time of stagnant wages and appalling wealth gaps, we should be expanding the refundable tax credits and increasing assistance to middle-class families. Could you clarify for me the administration's position on refundable tax credits, including the EITC, the CTC, the AOTC, as well as making the child care and dependent tax credits refundable? Thank you.
Thank you for your concern on those, and we believe many of those programs are critically important as you've described, and we're reviewing them.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Two thoughts. First, I'd like to thank Secretary Mnuchin for appearing for us today. Look forward to working with you on all these growth, jobs, and opportunity issues. Please be advised, Mr. Secretary, members of the committee have 2 weeks. Submit written questions to be answered later in writing. These questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. I also would like to make note that we are standing in recess as far as the healthcare markup. We expect to reconvene this evening after the second series of floor votes. With that, the committee stands adjourned.
All that you are. Appreciate you. You have a good team.